Hello, everyone. Am I looking? No, I'm looking up, right? So I don't have the right camera. Is that what we're
How many cameras
learning?
do you have? Yeah, you were looking up for a moment.
Okay, I'm going to get my right camera, everyone.
Okay.
Okay, let's see here. John, how are you doing? It's good to see you, sweetheart.
Yeah, I'm doing okay, thanks. It's been a while since you've been home, but we're making it work. So, how are you doing? I know you're not getting a lot of sleep.
No, but I'm getting some editing done, and I want to apologize to those that listen to our podcast that we are behind. It's always been just the two of us. And this trial has proven to us that we need a little bit more help. So I am working hard this weekend to get caught up on podcasts, and there are some exciting things coming. I want you to know I'm still doing interviews. We have 2 interviews coming. We have 3 or 4 podcasts coming. We have a podcast that I wrote myself that is coming. And we have a really exciting program, Hidden Hour, for you this Saturday night. In fact, I did not have much time to share this with a lot of people. So if you can let your friends know, and those that might be interested on Facebook or the social media where they follow this case, please do, because John has told me that, what have you told me, John? That there's going to be a big reveal tonight. This is true.
Yeah,
He's told me this. And,
yeah. Well, kind
and
of a little sarcastically, but I think it's a bit of a different slant on the phone call with Colby. So
yes, and
I,
John,
I listened to it. This is like the third or fourth time I've heard it. So finally, I think something kind of clicked for me today when I listened to it that I hadn't really seen before. So
when he says that, it was new to me. It was new to most everyone. I think pretty much everyone in that courtroom when we listened. And for all of you, it was new. But John had heard it before. John is one of the few people that had heard this phone call before court because he had sat and listened to it with Colby. It had been a while since he had heard it. And
yep,
um, I didn't know much about it. I'm the journalist and John's the forensic psychologist. So I come back and I know how to recap. I'm like, okay, this is what was said. This is what's important. Here are my live tweets. John comes home from hearing this phone call and I say, well, what was in this phone call? And he said, well, Colby was really angry. I'm like, okay, so tell me
right,
more.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
he
we're
never
looking
told
we're
me.
looking
He
at
never
things a
told me
little
that.
differently.
Yeah, he never told me that Colby wanted to hit Chad in the face with a shovel. He never told me a lot of the things that were said. I was really proud of Colby. So to clarify, I am going to trial every day. I have been going every day for 3 weeks now. Follow us on youtube.com/hidden true crime for daily lunch lives. I'm going live every day at lunch, letting you know. And then follow us on twitter.com/hidden true crime for my live tweeting in the courtroom. We've been following this case for 3 years. It's become personal to us. We're so grateful to be able to follow this trial. So in addition to that, we're going to be starting to post our podcasts soon again. And we will be going live. Then I do News Nation. I go live on News Nation on Banfield each night with an evening update. And then we stream the audio every evening on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/hidden true crime. So we've got a lot of trial update all day long. So thank you for following along with us. In addition to that, I just got a note from our live studio audience. So just 1 second. Yeah. I'm reading. Okay, perfect. She gave me one other time code. That's what she did.
Okay.
That's my wonderful friend and host. I'm actually staying. This is an interesting fact. I know you guys want to get on with the program, but an interesting fact. John and I are staying, or I am staying with a wonderful friend of both John, of ours, and she is the friend where I was when I had my first phone call with John. Do you remember that, John? I think we talked about
Yes,
3 different murder cases,
I do
and
remember that.
it
Yeah,
was
I
love
do.
at
Of
first
course, I
phone
remember
call.
that.
Yeah, love at first phone call. I was in Boise, Idaho when I first talked to John, and then he drove up to see me. I have been to the restaurant, John, where we had our first date 3 or 4 times already. So I think I went there a couple days ago. So
it's really good. It's a really good restaurant.
Yeah. So come visit soon, my love. All right. Okay. So yes, John has a big reveal. We're going to talk about this phone call, and then I would like to talk about David Warwick. So as far as this week goes, a lot of amazing testimonies in court. Again, you can go to our audio to listen and stream the day's audio. We had six or 7 witnesses alone on Thursday. They canceled court on Friday. I think the 2 biggest witnesses, though, that John and I want to talk about here tonight are Colby, and Colby, specifically Colby's Jailhouse call, which John has a huge reveal for us. I don't even know this reveal. And then I really want to delve into David Warwick because I was definitely triggered. So I need to talk that one out with everyone here with the gems. So anyway, thank you everyone for all you're doing. All right. We have some mods behind the scenes attempting to, I think, pin some comments. Text me, mods, if you're having a hard time or if you need help with anything. All right, John, where would you
let's start with Colby.
Okay.
You mentioned that we have been following this case for a while, and I know Colby personally. So, I listened to the call again and to Colby's testimony, and it was very emotional. I think every time I listen to that, it's very emotional. And I just want to set the stage a little bit for the call and say that it's important to understand with Colby, I believe that there's some parentification going on. And so what I mean by that is that sometimes in families, children will take on the role of a parent, and they'll take on especially the emotional role of the parent. And I really feel like at least prior to Charles, with Charles, it may have shifted a little bit, but certainly with Joe Ryan and Lori's previous husbands, I think Colby was her main person, her main relationship. And in that sense, Colby was very much parentified as a child. So I think he played this adult role for Lori quite often, at least emotionally. And my guess is that Lori really leaned on him more than a parent should for emotional support. So I think that's important to know because it sets the stage for this call. It shows just how courageous this call is, in the sense that parentified children in particular, they're usually not going to challenge their parent, the adult parent, as much as they might otherwise. So I think that in many ways, Colby and Lori were extremely close and very, very emotionally close. And so I think for Colby to do this, even though he's obviously an adult and he's married, I think for him to do this takes a lot of courage, and it's a very you can tell he's quite angry, but it's a very emotional call for Colby. And I just want to acknowledge that how difficult this was for Colby, and how in some ways this means that he's had to separate more and more from his mother, obviously. And this has created a lot of turmoil for him. But I really think that this is a parentified child. And I don't think in a million years Colby would have imagined that he would have been standing up to his mother like this. So, and showing up in court and testifying against his mother. So,
right.
So I want to set the stage with that because I think it's important. This isn't just a call where these two people really dislike each other or there's a lot of conflict, or right. These are two people that were extremely close. And this was a relationship that was probably dysfunctional, as most parentified relationships are, but it was a relationship where there was a lot of emotional support given and taken, not necessarily always in a healthy manner, but to do what Colby did, I think it took a lot of courage and it took a lot of fortitude. And I think, I give Colby a lot of kudos for doing what he did.
Yes. And I do want to say, as far as his testimony goes, his whole testimony, I was very impressed with him. He answered directly, specifically, with certainty, with confidence. He did not go off on tangents. He did not sit and ponder and wonder. He answered most questions with a yes or no. He answered most questions. If he had to share a little bit more, it was 1 or 2 sentences, which is actually being an excellent witness for the court, is to answer so straightforward. And he did that. At one point, though, they did ask him, Colby, do you love your mother? And he said, yes. And then they said, does your mother love you? And he said, I think so. So he had some profound, honest answers. I felt for him.
Right. I don't think you just stop loving someone given their history. And even though everything's changed, it's certainly been a unforeseen journey for Colby. It's been a difficult journey for Colby. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't still love her and he's still not heartbroken. He says that in the call that she broke his heart. So that's true.
Yes, and I do think that Colby's testimony hit the jury hard to answer Kelly's question. Yes. Yeah, I don't think it couldn't not be. It was very overwhelming. It was an emotional moment.
Yeah. It's an extremely emotional call. Right. I don't know how it couldn't influence the jury unless the jury's made of steel. It's a very human and emotional call, and, between a mother and a son. And yeah, I would imagine it did.
All right. So should I start the call? Should I start playing some of the call?
Let's go right to it.
All right. I want to share something. So we have this call in 2 places on our YouTube channel. We have it in our live streamed or our streamed audio. It's not live, but we do a streaming that's live and a chat that's live directly after the court sends down the audio on our channel. It's there, and then I cut it and I put Colby's Jailhouse call on our YouTube channel as well, and you can listen to it there. But I am going to give East Idaho News some kudos as well, and I always say that this is a village that is reporting on this case. We need everyone. There are some really incredible reporters on this case, and East Idaho News really cleaned up the audio. They must have used some really high-tech audio people. They knew what they were doing, and so we're going to use their copy to listen to this. And so I want to give them credit, and here is the link to that. I just posted it, and the link is also in the description of our video. And so thank you to East Idaho News for figuring out how to really clean up this important audio that we're going to use today. All right. Okay.
Probably because you murdered my siblings. It's probably why it's hugging you. Maybe you should understand.
I didn't. I'm sorry that you feel that way.
You didn't do anything, right? Mom, I've prayed for you in my worst moments. I have prayed for my siblings who swore to me were okay. I thought I could trust you. I thought that you were a completely different person. I don't know a murderous mother.
You can make judgments when you weren't there and you don't know what happened.
What happened?
Everyone's making their own judgments.
Mom, you've been shoving BS down my throat for a very long time. I'm going to talk to you
You could be
in
mad.
a sweet. Hey, listen to me. I'm not mad. Listen to me. Fine, listen to me. I've sat there and prayed. I can't tell you the amount of pain that I have felt from your decisions in Jesus Christ's name. It kills me to watch you sit here and tell me this is a trial. It kills me to watch you take the victim's route and say that this shouldn't have happened to you. When you are telling me that Chad Daybell came into your life and all of a sudden everything changes. And I'm talking about my spirit feels this. this. I prayed. I trusted you. I gave you every chance I could, past my own limitations as a human being. I pushed past all of everything to try to get to you, to help my own mother. You lied to me, specifically to me, more times than I can count about this. To know that they're gone and you knew, and my phone's being texted by my little sister who's not even alive, my little brother who's the sweetest little kid ever, for what purpose? Can you tell me if this is God's will for my whole family, including my stepfather, to be dead? After everything that you try to tell me, you can tell me right now that Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, is on your side. You tell me that with all the conviction in your heart that Jesus Christ is on your side right now. Please.
I can't tell you that.
Say it. Say his name. Say that he told you. And you followed him like exactness. Because I have prayed for you. I sat there and tried my best to forgive you and Chad and Alex.
John, you wave to me when you want me to stop it. Do you want me to? Oh, you're on mute.
Let's
You're on mute,
unpack
John.
some of that. Let's unpack some of that a little bit.
Okay, yeah, and because I don't know when you want me to stop, just wave at me, okay? I'm looking for you.
So let's start with fairly early on in that conversation. Lori says you weren't there and you didn't know what happened. This is going to be a perpetual theme in this call. She will repeatedly tell Colby that he wasn't there, that people weren't there, they don't understand, they don't know what happened. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But before we do, I think one of the critical moments in this call is Colby asks Lori, so he says to Lori, tell me that you have Jesus on your side. And she says, I can tell you that. In other words, she answers affirmatively. Very rarely in this call does she answer anything affirmatively. But in that moment, she says, yes, I have Jesus on my side. She won't say his name, but she says that Jesus is on her side. So right away, we have this. She's playing her hand a little bit. She's telling us that she still believes everything that she believed before during this call, that she does in a peculiar way. She sees Jesus as condoning the murder of the kids, right? So, I mean, a lot of people have pointed out and told us over the past few years how crazy it is that if you see Jesus as signing off on murders and being fine with that, condoning murder, that obviously that's very contrary to how most people, I think, would think of Christianity. So right away, I think this affirmation that she can say that, yes, Jesus is on my side, he agrees with what we did here is okay. Right away, she's telling us that not only does she believe all this stuff and continue to believe all this stuff, but in many ways, she's showing us how distorted her belief system is from, say, like a historical Christian viewpoint or Mormon viewpoint, right? She's deviating so far from the norm that in some ways, I think that's part of the issue here is this becomes really hard to understand because she's so far on the extreme that you have to try to get into her mindset, and we'll kind of do that tonight. But I think to really understand Lori, and that was a little bit of my aha moment tonight. Oh, is my mic not on?
No, you're on. I put
Okay.
myself on mute.
So this is the first moment I think that's really significant, is that he pushes her and forces her hand to acknowledge that whether Jesus is on her side. In other words, he's kind of pressing her belief system about Christianity. And she says, I can tell you that. So she's basically saying that Jesus thinks that murdering all of these people and these children is okay. So to me, that's an incredible moment, that it shows you how far down the rabbit hole she's gone and how extreme her beliefs have become and how she won't relent. She won't relinquish in spite of the fact that the world has been looking at her and challenging her and her son is confronting her. Her son is in her face. She will not relinquish her belief system or she will not look at reality. So that's...
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's where I start, because it really shows that very little has changed. And I think that's where Colby's trying to confront her on this issue, by saying essentially, Mom, Jesus does not condone murder. But you are. So what gives? Like, what do you not see what you've become? And of course he can't make any headway. But so this is really the moment where I think we see that very clearly. That Colby is challenging her belief system. And my guess is the belief system that he knew growing up when she was different and maybe not as extreme. And so I think this is an interesting moment to me.
Some people are pointing out, and it's something I brought up to you, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, but she didn't really answer him. He continued this. She did say he's on my side, and then he said, say it.
Right.
Say that he did this, that this is his thing. And he kind of kept that theme throughout the whole call.
Yeah.
And clearly, Colby's really religious. Lori's really religious, for good or for bad, or mostly bad. But that's a part of their relationship. And she, to me, never seemed like she was fully answering beyond this moment. She said, he is on my side. But then as he pushed and prodded, I actually felt like she did avoid saying it so firmly.
Well, she knows she's been recorded. So, that's another interesting component of this. I think that this question about competence and whether she understands fully what's going on, she shows here she does, because she's being recorded and she never plays her hand openly. I mean, we can read between the lines when he says, do you have Jesus on your side? And she says, I can tell you that she does. She's not saying it, but she is saying it. So, right. It shows that she's aware. It shows that she's playing a little bit of a game with Colby here in the sense that she's not going to really fully play her hand because she knows she's being recorded. Somebody who is incompetent and maybe floridly psychotic is going to have a lot more trouble understanding those nuances, by the way. She understands those nuances. She goes up to the edge with Colby and she won't take, she's obviously not taking any accountability, but she avoids crossing that line and saying what Colby wants. So I think that's another interesting part of this phone call, is that at least in this moment, she certainly seems to be aware and competent and more than capable of kind of playing this cat and mouse game with Colby. So that's something else going on here.
Yeah. A lot of people have been asking when this phone call is. And while I don't think we have the exact date, John, you first heard it quite a while ago. Can you recall the first time?
So it would have been like roughly fall of 2021.
Was it 2021 and not 2020?
2021, I believe. I think 2021.
Okay.
No, maybe it could have been 2020. I don't even know. Yeah, it's a good question.
I think it might have been 2020.
Could have been 2020. Yeah, it could have been really early on.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe it was October 2020.
Okay. Yeah. Didn't they would have to introduce that into evidence, right?
Yes. And it was during the pandemic. Everybody had to be wearing
Okay.
masks. So that would have been
That's
2020.
right. Yeah. Okay. It feels like it's been so long, but yeah,
I know.
I agree. It was fall of 2020 or 21, but I think you're right. I think it was 2020.
So in that sense, we know that it was recorded before then, although we don't have the exact date.
Right. Before she was deemed incompetent. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Before she was deemed incompetent. That's right. Do you want me to play the next clip?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to pull this up and kind of stream it forward. 1 second.
I was deceived.
Here we go. And then when we get here, John, if you just would remember to put your mic on mute so it doesn't echo.
And one day you will know.
Murder.
One day
Murder.
you will know what actually happened.
You're right. Because you know what, Mom?
And we all will stand there with
everything
We-
into the light. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. He will convict the people who act in his name with pure blasphemy. This is funny? This is funny? This is funny. You're laughing. Like, this is funny. How come your camera's on, Mom? You don't want to look at me in the eye? Why can't you look at me? It's
nice
just
to
you
talk
and me.
to
I'm in
you,
my house
folks.
alone.
I love you. I always will. One day you will see and one day you will understand.
Go ahead and hang
I
up.
do love
See
you.
how that works for you. You gonna hang up?
I don't have anything else to say. You obviously don't know.
Let me tell you
You
something,
weren't
Mom.
there. You weren't there. Summer wasn't there. My mom wasn't there. The police weren't there. The FBI weren't there.
You're right.
Nobody
Mom
was there.
Kylie and JJ, Mom.
Yeah, and guess
Tell
what?
me,
They
JJ.
know. They know
Barely.
exactly what happened.
Backyard.
And they love me. And we are still together forever. They love me. And they are fine. And they do know the truth. And I know the truth. And we're the
They
only
do.
people that do. So you can judge me, Colby, all day long. Go ahead and judge me. The whole world
Judge me?
has. The whole world
Brother,
has judged me.
Listen to me.
They
please.
don't
Hey,
know, and
please
you
stop.
don't know.
1 second.
You don't know what I've been through, and you don't even give a crap what they've been through. Nobody does,
I don't.
except for me. I'm the one that knows. I'm the one that was in the hospital with Kylie for hundreds of days watching her suffer. I'm the one that was there doing everything with JJ every day. I was the one who did it all these years.
You did it all to throw it in the garbage. They're not.
You don't know what happened. You don't know what happened.
Freaking matter what happened if they're buried in your new husband's backyard. Tell me that matters what happened. You tell me that you did this in Jesus' name, Mom. I have to hear that out of your mouth. If you believe it, then you are not afraid. Every witness of Christ will scream his name when he comes back.
All right, go ahead, babe. Oh, I took you off mute. Sorry, and then you did it again. My apologies.
Am I
Yeah,
Am I
you're
on?
off now. Sorry.
okay? So when I listened to this again earlier today, and I keep hearing this banter, and I keep thinking, I'm trying to figure out what Colby's thinking, and Colby sees this as murder.
Yes.
He sees this as probably Alex Cox or maybe Chad. He's assigning a human being to these murders.
Yes.
And so when I listened to it again, I started to figure out why they're not communicating and why this is a miscommunication. And so this is the big reveal. And I think for me, I see human beings as committing murder, right? So most of us do. That's human beings kill one another. That's what they do. Sometimes, hopefully not that often, but when human beings are dysfunctional and angry and violent. Sometimes that's what happens. But I realized that Lori doesn't see this as murder because Lori doesn't see these murders as having been committed by a human being. The reveal is that Lori believes that the children weren't murdered. They were taken in a merciful fashion by an angel or angels or some translated being or something that wasn't human. And so they're not communicating, because when Lori keeps saying, one day you'll understand and you weren't there, like this whole thing about being there is really important. But because I think Lori doesn't actually see that a human being did this. I think even if Lori says or thinks it's Alex Cox, she thinks that Alex Cox is not human in the sense that he's a warrior and he might be translated, right? During the blessing, we see how Chad interprets Alex Cox, how he perceives Alex Cox. And remember that when Lori and Chad were sealed, they both said that Jesus Christ was present.
Correct.
Lori's always talking about angels. When Chad was arrested, Chad believed that the remains would be taken up to heaven, or right, that they would be removed so the police wouldn't have any evidence by an angel.
Although I will share one little scoop. John doesn't know this yet. One little scoop from testimony. Chad, right before his arrest on June 9th, 2020, as police were searching in his yard for JJ and Tylee's remains, which they were about to find, he wired or sent, I don't know how he did it, but sent 3 of his children $8,000 each.
Yeah,
almost prepping for an arrest. But you're right. But there's another.
There's if you look closely enough, I think, and if you get into really delve into Lori's belief system, I think the thing that hit me today was the miscommunication here is that Lori doesn't see any of this as occurring between human beings. That Lori thinks that the kids were literally zombies and they weren't murdered. They were somehow released from their bodies, and they were released by angels or translated beings, or so he doesn't. The reveal is that Lori doesn't see this drama as occurring between humans in the human materialistic world. And I think that's where her smugness comes in. That's where when she keeps saying, one day you will understand, you weren't there. Like, what she's saying essentially is, you don't get my beliefs. You don't get, Colby, that they weren't murdered at all. They were just released or taken, or whatever term she wants to use, right? So I think there's a fundamental miscommunication, because Colby is like most of us. Colby thinks that when you take someone's life in a violent fashion, you're murdering them. But Lori doesn't see it that way. I think Lori truly believes that this has to do with angels, or it has to do with more, it occurs on a spiritual plane. And so that's the miscommunication. When she says you weren't there, I think what she's saying in a way is, you can't see what I see. You can't see the spiritual dimension that I can see, so you won't understand. You can never understand. And it's hard to get into that mindset, because it was hard for me to see it, because I'm used to dealing with, real life materialistic murder, which is exactly what happened here. But that's not how Lori.
This is murder. Yeah.
This is murder, but that's not how Lori sees it. She sees it as something else. So when you use the term murder with Lori, it's not going to register, because to her, this is not murder. Zulema said that Lori felt like the children being deceased was an act of mercy, right? And that's similar in the sense that she believes these children are possessed. In fact, she says in part of that, what we just listened to, you don't know. She says, you don't know what they've been through, meaning the children. You don't know what they've been through. What she means is,
This is the
Which-
worst part for me.
What she means is they're zombies, they're suffering, they're in pain. Again, like it's to us, it's counterintuitive because we don't live in this spiritual plane that Lori's on, but it's what she's saying essentially. I think what she's saying is they've been through more than you can imagine. These kids suffered, they needed to be released, and they were released on the spiritual dimension or the celestial dimension by something that wasn't human. Even if that was Alex Cox, Lori doesn't see that as occurring in the human world, in the materialistic world. She sees that occurring in another dimension. And so that I think that's where this becomes really confusing to a lot of people, because to get into that particular worldview, it takes some work. It took me some work, but it finally clicked for me when I listened to this again, that these two are they're miles apart, because Colby sees his siblings as real people that he interacts with and loves and wants to play with again. That's not how Lori sees it. Lori sees these children as zombies. She sees them as existing in a different dimension and therefore being released in a different dimension. And so it's obviously a really peculiar belief system, but it's a belief system that's driving her, and it's driving her communications, and it's driving everything in her world. And it's what's leading to their inability to connect. And they'll never connect unless Lori acknowledges that this was murder and not something else. I don't know what she would call it, release. I don't know. Whatever it is she thinks this is, she doesn't think this is murder.
So I'm seeing a lot of questions and a lot of comments on this, and I want you guys all to know we're gonna delve into everything you guys are asking, because I'm looking at a lot of comments and questions right now with the same. Right. Yeah, Jason, you keep writing the same thing, Jason, and I just want you to know we know about what you're referring to. It doesn't have to do with this show, okay? And it's a very sad event that Jason keeps bringing up. Nancy. Oh, so Shelly, I want to go back to Shelly really quickly. Shelly Garrett's comment.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for your kind super chats and questions. We're going to work to get to as many as we can. So Shelly states, if she was a true believer, why didn't she bring Colby into the belief system? I want to answer that really quickly, because it has to do with April Raymond's testimony, actually. April Raymond testified as well on Thursday. And, you know, April has a lot of stories to share, a lot of things to say, but she pretty much stuck to how Lori tried to recruit her into the belief system.
Yeah.
That she had been friends with Lori for a long time. They were in what was called the primary presidency together, meaning that they helped the kids, that they learned of Jesus and of faith. They traveled together. They spent time on the beach together. Their kids were friends. They were all close, in other words, and that her belief system sort of changed, and that Lori tried to then recruit April. And April shared how she started telling her about the Second Comforter experience. She gave her this book, The Second Comforter, that all of a sudden she started talking about meeting Jesus Christ, being a gatherer, being 144, had to do with Jason Mao, she said. She dropped Jason Mao's name and Thor's name and Chad's name. Anyway, she answered this question. She didn't believe it. And she told this to Lori. And at that moment, Lori concluded that April was not ready to hear this message. That she, rather than thinking, oh, I might be wrong, let me check my confirmation bias. Oh, a few people in my life are telling me that maybe this is bizarre. Lori just took it as, oh, April is just not ready for this higher message, this higher belief system. She has to be ready. And if she doesn't believe it, she's just not ready. So as far as why didn't she tell Colby about it? At this point, Colby wasn't even a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He had left this church, that church, when he got married and joined his wife Kelsey's, I don't know if it was non-denominational, but he became what he refers to as Christian. I think more of a non-denominational church. So I think that's the answer to that. And there are a lot of questions, and let me sum
Well,
these up.
let me chime in
go
on
ahead.
that
Okay,
too
go ahead.
quickly. So, you know, some people are more suggestible than other people, and some of that's temperamental. Some of it is, I could get into a whole thing about beliefs and why people believe things, and that's probably best left for a later show. But in a nutshell, we're gonna, let me just say this really quickly, that there was a philosopher, David Hume, who a Scottish philosopher, David Hume, who was probably the first person to really think deeply about the nature of beliefs from a philosophical standpoint. And his perception was that beliefs are essentially feelings, or they can be. But for some people, beliefs are feelings. For other people, beliefs are more rational. There's something that's called justified true belief, which is that exactly what it sounds. That some people step back from their beliefs, and they have to make sense of them from a rational standpoint. And so in other words, they justify their beliefs based on reason. Other people are much more emotional, and they cling to beliefs based on their feelings about certain things. And so I think in that broad sense, some people are much more suggestible and much more susceptible to spurious beliefs, such as that the earth is flat, for example. You know, there are people that still believe that, even though the evidence is clearly against that. They believe it because it's not rational. It has to do with something they're feeling. So for whatever reasons and whatever the context is and whatever the subject is, people really vary. But people that are more susceptible to seeing beliefs as feelings are going to jump on beliefs much more readily if they somehow resonate with someone emotionally. Psychologists sometimes call this hot cognition. Hot cognition is when you have a set of beliefs or thoughts that are closely associated with emotion. And hot cognition essentially means that when certain beliefs get triggered or thoughts get triggered, that you're immediately emotional about it. So you can't really step back and assess it, which is kind of contrary to the whole philosophical idea of justified true beliefs. So, which is the ability to step back and look at your beliefs and examine them to see if they're logical and if they make sense, if they're empirically grounded, which means they're based on facts and evidence, right? Those are two very different ways of looking at the world. So the short answer is, do I know which camp Colby's in? No, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that April Raymond, for example, is probably less emotional about her beliefs and more factual, and in that sense, she's less easily to persuade. So Lori and Chad clearly would fall in the camp of being more emotional and more feelings based about their beliefs. And so I think that's an important distinction to make in terms of evaluating that question.
Let me address a few other things that I'm seeing scrolling down.
Okay.
By saying Lori believes, we're in no way excusing her. May justice be served. She, you know,
Yeah.
by
in fact, it's the opposite. By saying that she believes, I think we're holding her more accountable, because the other thing about beliefs, I think there's a big question in philosophy about if you hold a set of beliefs just based on your feelings and they're completely irrational and illogical and they can create harm, do we have a moral and ethical obligation to then examine our beliefs and correct our beliefs so that they're not as harmful? And so I think, right, and so that in some ways, by saying that she's a true believer and her beliefs are extreme, I think in some ways I think we're maybe holding her more accountable and saying, why aren't you examining these beliefs? Do you have a moral and ethical obligation to examine these beliefs? Because people have died because of these beliefs, right? So,
well, I want to say that was the next thing I wanted to share. In court, every day of trial, there hasn't been a single day that these beliefs and this belief system and people that believe these things have come up. This trial is an absolute examining of extreme religious beliefs. I see a friend of the program on chat right now, Mindy Caldwell. I was sitting next to Mindy for a couple of days. She traveled here, and we were listening to the patriarchal blessing together that Chad gave to Alex. Again, reading it was one thing, hearing it was another. And Mindy turned to me, and the first thing she said was, if I had any doubt whether or not they really believed, that's gone now. These people really believed. And both in the opening statements, they brought up extreme beliefs. Every witness so far, not law enforcement, but as far as friends, they have discussed extreme religious beliefs. Even Colby's call, April, Zulema, Melanie, David, all of the friends that have, the people that aren't official, but just witnesses to what they saw happening. It's been about religious beliefs. Melanie Gibb tries to claim she didn't totally believe, as does David Warwick. And you're right, John, that actually just drives me crazy. It makes it worse to me.
This question by Ozzy Tad here, who's a good friend of our show, who's been a good friend of our show for many years. I don't think those are mutually exclusive. So which do you want to read it?
Let's see if I can. Yes, John, people should constantly challenge their beliefs, but some people value faith over evidence.
So I think those aren't mutually exclusive in the sense that someone can have faith and still evaluate their beliefs based on evidence. I think it's when that split becomes too extreme that it presents problems. You can have faith and you can be a believer and you can still evaluate evidence that's consistent with, unless maybe the faith, if your beliefs are too extreme, it's going to be more difficult. But I don't think it's necessarily one or the other.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that. As someone that is a faithful person, I concur. I feel like as a journalist, I can really weigh evidence and even try to separate myself from my biases. It's hard, but thank you for acknowledging
the last
that.
comment about regardless of beliefs, murder is a crime. Yes, I agree, but I think totally agree, obviously. But I think that, again, my insight earlier today and listening to this conversation again was that Lori she really does not see this as murder.
What about this, though? What about that day that she refused to see the children's autopsy? As you said, she was disassociating. And she did cry. She did cry while listening to Colby's testimony and seeing Colby. It was legit. Her face was red. She was dabbing her eyes with a tissue and dabbing it in a very dramatic way, kind of lightly, trying to, I think, save a little bit of mascara she might have had on or something. The two most emotional days have been seeing her children's autopsies and for everyone in the court and the jury, as well as Colby's phone call. I would say it's been the two most emotional moments.
Yeah, and those are the two most factually based days too, in the sense that those are both instances of significant evidence challenging her beliefs. So I think there's a lot of denial there, and it's probably almost impenetrable, her belief system. But in the two instances where there may have been a little bit of a challenge to her beliefs, yeah, she's emotional because it's probably the first time that her defenses have really been, I don't want to say cracked a little bit. That they've been challenged or they've been, confronted. So
yeah,
so that would explain why, right? That those have been the most emotional and factually based challenges to her belief system.
Yeah. And I agree. We're not taking away accountability by sharing this belief system. In no way are we even saying she's incompetent. As people have pointed out, she manipulates people. She lies to people. She deceives people. All those things are still true. She dismisses people. She dehumanizes people. She allows people to be killed for her. She has a lot of confirmation bias, I see, where she wants something. And so thus she'll create a belief system around it somehow to make it happen. But in some ways she strangely believes it. So again, by pointing out truth to some bizarre things, you're right. We're not taking away her accountability. And you're right. We started Hidden a True Crime podcast to delve into the hidden motives because we don't want things like this to happen again. And if we deny what we see, we don't ever get to the root of the problem. We don't ever say, this is a problem. And if we can stop it next time, or acknowledge what it really is.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. The other side of the belief equation is one of the things Hume, the Scottish philosopher, said was, even though beliefs for many people are largely feelings, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a certain amount of logic and reason that enters the equation too. So I think Hume would definitely say that if your beliefs are based solely on feelings, then you're going to have a lot of problems too, because you're going to be dragged through life by your feelings, and you're not going to sit back and evaluate anything logically. So I think for Hume, the ideal is to kind of meet halfway, to meet in the middle, to have reason and logic with feelings in some combination. And that's probably the best way to challenge your beliefs, or to consider our beliefs, is to find that middle ground. I think your mic's off.
One question that has been posed throughout this, and then we'll get back to listening to Colby's Jailhouse call. And we're not dismissing Colby's anger either. I am actually so proud of Colby. I mean, I don't think anybody's thinking that, but I feel like some people saying, "Oh, you're dismissing her accountability, or you're dismissing this call." Like that, Colby was doing what needed to be done to attempt to drill reality into his mother. He was so angry, and rightfully so. And that's why, like, she would not acknowledge anything, and he deserved that acknowledgement, and she deserved his rage after what she did to him and his whole family.
Yeah, Colby told me that he just wanted her to acknowledge what she did. He was looking for some type of closure, and he felt like the best way, and when I say closure, I don't mean full closure. I mean just some way to accept the situation and to cope with the situation. He was just looking for some way to, as he says later in the call, that he wasn't sure he would survive. That he said the pain in his body was so intense that he felt at times like he would die. And he wasn't sure he could survive this. So when I say closure, I mean, he just wanted to survive. And the best way for him to do that, according to Colby, was just to have his mom own up to some of it, to take some accountability and to acknowledge it. Otherwise, he felt like he was living in this alternative universe. Your mic.
I apologize. I put it on mute to try to type to people. Someone was asking why you thought that Lori broke down the other day. I said, we have a whole video on that. Can someone find the link? So if someone has the link to that video, please, if anybody's asking about things we've covered and you guys see it, please share links. It means so much to us to lead people where they need to go to find our information. I think I think a lot of us are really triggered by Lori possibly being incompetent or innocent or all that. And again, we're not saying any of that, but what is the difference between really, really extreme religious beliefs, and at what point does that become delusional? That's something I've been having a hard time. And sorry, maybe that's a whole other show. You don't need to answer that. But I think that's actually a question I posed to Ashley Banfield on News Nation before this trial started, is what do you think might be some of the questions that we're going to have to process and analyze during this trial? And I said, at what point do these extreme religious beliefs, are they extreme religious beliefs? Is it delusional? At what point?
So the field of psychology has a lot of research trying to answer that question. It's a really difficult question to answer. And the evidence for that would be the fact that multiple people have performed forensic evaluations on Lori, and they've come to different conclusions. So, this actually goes back in terms of the history of Western thought, this actually goes back to Plato and the idea of the cave, and how in the cave you couldn't see reality, but if you left the cave in the true light of the sun, you would see reality and truth. And like the trying to your question at the highest level is a question about how do we make distinctions between truth and fiction, and basically, or truth and, between reality and illusion. That's the way Plato would put it. And I don't, so your question is, you're talking about almost 3,000 years of Western thought that's tried to answer that unsuccessfully. So, we could spend a couple of shows on that and we wouldn't scratch the surface. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, right. It's a question. Okay. Well, I'm glad I'm not the only one with the question.
Yeah, from a very pragmatic standpoint, I think the experts that were brought in to assess Lori have not agreed. And I think that's really all you need to know. That I haven't seen any of that work, so I can't comment on it, but I do know that, there's been multiple opinions and there's no consensus. So that alone tells you that if forensic experts can't agree, that we're probably dealing with some gray area and some difficult terrain in terms of knowing when it crosses over into delusion, or knowing, knowing what's too extreme and what's not. I think it's a really, really hard question to answer.
Yes. Should we keep listening? We haven't even gotten to David Warwick. Should we just?
Yeah, I think we should. We might want to shift gears. I'm looking at the time, and
okay, let me see if there's anything else. I want to point. Well, let me point out one more thing then that we just listened to that we haven't even touched on, but we already listened to it. And it upset me.
Okay.
What we just listened to, I hope that most people heard it before we had started this discussion, was Lori. Again, you did state this, Lori, saying, well, Tylee and JJ, you weren't there. The FBI wasn't there. Summer, her sister, wasn't there. I know, and JJ and Tylee were there, which just sounds the most horrendous thing ever. They were there while being murdered. Yes, of course they were there. JJ and Tylee were there, and they love me. And then after she states with this certainty that her murdered children love her, she then jumps into, you weren't there when I spent hundreds of hours with Tylee at the hospital. That was such a bizarre jump to me. And you and I have discussed Tylee's hospitalization. You have suggested through research and evidence some possibilities there. Lori has a history of poisoning people. Lori has a history of wanting this type of attention. We wondered about Munchausen, which is now not called that. But what did you think about this strange transition from, you weren't there when the kids were murdered, the murdered kids were there, they loved me, you weren't there when I spent 100 hours with Tylee in the hospital either? That's some twisty stuff right there. Yeah,
I know, right? She's associating murder and love with one another, which is, you're doing a lot of mental gymnastics when you go down that path. That we murdered the kids, but I know they still love me. I think it speaks to this idea that we've talked about repeatedly with Lori, which is what she wants above all else is love. And yes, I think the attention and the validation and all of that is in some ways playing into this need for love, this endless abyss of love that she seeks. And in fact, that's precisely what Chad Daybell sort of used to persuade her. He was telling her that she was a goddess and that they would have a celestial love, sort of like we knew that she was obsessed with Twilight, that she wanted this immortal, eternal love that would go on forever. And again, we're back in the celestial realm, right? It's not. She struggles to really be grounded in this world, and so I think that speaks to that. She can't to acknowledge that these children were murdered without somehow equating it with love, I think is nearly impossible for her. That she has to she has to bend that a little bit. She has to distort that and associate it with love, because that's what she wants. That's what she's all about. And she's, no matter what, she's going to cling to this idea that the children loved her, even though they were murdered, and presumably murdered in part because of her. So, but yeah, it is a really peculiar moment in that call where she's equating love with murder, and the kids still love her even though they were murdered. I mean, it's hard to fathom.
Yes, it is hard to fathom. I was very proud, though, that proud, sure, I can say proud, when Colby said he wanted to hit her new husband in the face with a shovel. The courtroom was like, yes. Okay, we need to get to David Warwick, and this is actually a good.
The jury. Well, how did
The jury,
respond
the whole court. What I mean is, yeah, not the prosecution, not the defense, not the judge. I mean the public and the jury. I mean those of us sitting in the pews, in the benches.
So the
the
jury wasn't fist bumping one another.
Right. No, they were not.
Oh, okay.
But I was looking next to. I often sit by. I made a new friend. His name is Ray. Ray goes to court every day. He's public. He's older gentleman, and he is just interested in this case. I think many of us know that it's usually women that attend every day and that are more dedicated to getting to the bottom of true crime. But Ray is there. He's dedicated. He's there every day. So I sit by Ray, and he's, we looked at each other like, yeah, he said that.
Right. A shovel. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is actually a good transition, because people are actually asking a few things about if this is going to help the defense, because, Colby was blaming Chad for his mother changing. He wanted to hit Chad in the face with a shovel. He, the defense, when they cross-examine, you can tell that they're often sort of pushing for this narrative of other people being responsible, whether it's Chad, whether it's David Warwick, whether it's Melanie Gibb, whether it's Zulema. And that leads us to David Warwick. So in order to answer that question, or talk about that question that people have, is this somehow helping the defense by blaming Chad? I think we should delve into David Warwick. I was fascinated. I was triggered. I was angry. I was all sorts of things with David Warwick. And I've talked to John a lot about it. You've listened to a lot of the things, a lot of his testimony that I shared with you, particularly the defense's cross-exam. Let's start there, and we'll get into this discussion a bit.
Yeah, on that question quickly though, it could potentially be a problem for the prosecution, but unless they're able to tie Chad and Lori's belief systems together, right? And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to connect them. That's how. So, but if they just try to pin it, the defense, I'm sure this is what I've called the Breaking Bad defense, which is Chad comes in the picture, Lori breaks bad, she becomes this completely different person, and Chad is responsible for everything. That's the Breaking Bad defense. I think the prosecution is aware of that, and they're going to want to obviously tie Lori closely to Chad. They have the Melanie Gibb call. There's a lot of evidence showing that Chad and Lori both knew. They both acted together, right? And so I think that's how you kind of overcome that obstacle.
Yeah. And to add to that too, the defense, I want to point out there's a lot of, there's criticism for both the prosecution and defense. Of course, John and I aren't necessarily a law tube channel. You're a psychologist, I'm a journalist. We're sharing what's happening. And we don't have we're not like team defense or team prosecution. We're team truth. We're team evidence. We're team justice. And one thing I want to say that is interesting about the defense is, they did get the death penalty off the table early on. We've talked about that. That was probably one of their biggest goals. So I think they're, in my opinion, I'm just guessing, probably a bit more relaxed, knowing that
Yeah.
they have already accomplished their main goal.
Right.
But one thing I've appreciated about the defense is that their defense doesn't seem to be Lori is innocent. In fact, their opening statements kind of implied that this is a hard case, and but everyone deserves a fair trial, and I'm here to make sure things don't get taken out of context, that things are accurate, and that the truth is out. I actually really respected the opening statements. I mean, I know that a lot of people disagree, so I'm not trying to persuade someone the other way, just sharing my opinion. But
Well,
go
it's
ahead.
also worth noting that the goal of every defense team is to force the prosecution or the state to make their case and to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. So no matter what else they're doing, they're forcing the state to really up their game and to prove their case, right? And
that's good too.
that's the way our legal system works. So whether you love them or hate them or whatever, it's the nature of the game.
It's the nature of the game, and you're right. When you have a good defense, you have a good prosecution, because the prosecution then has to up their game and really prove their point. You're exactly right. And what the defense is doing is, how I see it, is I think they're really showing that if Lori is guilty, so are these other people. I know that they probably have maybe a different agenda, so I'm not saying what they're doing. I'm saying how I feel, which is I feel that there are additionally, co-conspirators. Those have been discussed by both the prosecution and the defense. And a lot of those co-conspirators are walking free and pointing the finger at one woman in the court who, I hope justice is served, but I hope other people are held accountable too. And in many ways, I feel like the defense, through their arguments, is holding other people accountable.
Well,
and
I
that's
think
good to me.
One of the ways to introduce reasonable doubt, or so reasonable doubt, is to blur the lines of accountability.
Yes.
And I think they're definitely doing that, or trying to do that. How the jury sees it, I don't know. But to me, it reminds me a little bit of a drug cartel, in the sense that you go after El Chapo. You don't go after the middleman that's distributing drugs and doesn't really, has a role in the cartel, but doesn't have a massive role and isn't really responsible for a lot of the major drug transactions and getting drugs into different countries. And right. So I think you have that problem here, that you have a lot of witnesses that are sort of mid-level players in this cult, or whatever you want to call it. But they're not running it. Right. And so the prosecution always has to make decisions about immunity and witnesses, and they have to define what they're trying to do and what their goals are. So obviously it seems like their major goal here is to go after the people at the top, and just like you would go after El Chapo, and not some mid-level, drug runner. So there's always compromises, but I agree. I think that there is some issue here about blurring lines of who did what and when, and who was accountable and who made decisions. And I think that's a sound strategy if you're trying to introduce some reasonable doubt.
Sure, I agree. I just want everyone to know, though, as someone that's been sitting in court, I feel like there has been a lot of evidence pointed at both Lori and Chad. A lot. Laura can, I see other people in chat that are also there. They can share their opinions. This is an opinion, not a, we're all going to have different opinions. I feel like, in more of a sense, the defense is pointing out that there are other accountable people here that should be held accountable.
Right.
And that again feels good to me. And
no
that's why I
doubt
was so grateful for the defense when it came to David Warwick.
And no doubt, you and I have talked about this. We talked about this, I don't know, over a year ago, about Melanie Gibbs' role and David Warwick's role. And, we analyzed Melanie Gibbs' interview, and there's a lot of questions there. It's certainly not clear cut.
Right. So, David Warwick, there's a lot to talk about. We want to talk about the nightmare. I want to talk about a few things the defense said. Where would you like to start, Dr. Bailey?
Yeah, I feel like we're a little pressed for time here, because
right.
our son, I need to go get our son soon, but the nightmare, I think the most important part of the testimony has to be the nightmare, because I've got some serious questions about that.
Yes. And that's where I was grateful again for the defense. They drilled this home. They questioned him. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I did not get time codes in time to share David Warwick's testimony, but we were all listening earlier today. I could maybe find it. Anyway, keep talking. I'll look while you.
So the nightmare, do you want to just talk about what that is really quickly?
Yeah. Let me set the stage for what this nightmare is. So the nightmare came out in some early police interviews that were released in FOIA docs with Melanie Gibb and David Warwick, explaining that the night JJ died, not only were they in Rexburg, staying in a little tiny townhome with Lori, and sleeping in JJ's room, and Tylee wasn't there, that in the middle of the night, David had a nightmare that he claimed is the worst nightmare he's ever had. And it was so bad, according to Melanie and David, they got up in the middle of the night, and Melanie rushed to Lori's room to try the door to get, Melanie rushed to Lori's room, to try to open her door and request that Lori come out to give David a blessing, meaning, that was a question that the defense drilled home. Why did you need a blessing for a nightmare? And the door was locked. And at that point, they tried calling Lori and they tried calling Chad. This would be the early morning hours. So 2-ish, 3, I think 2 o'clock is what Melanie said. Again, this was the night. So they had seen JJ that night. David Warwick was possibly the last person to see JJ. He claims he saw JJ being carried upstairs by his uncle Alex into Lori's bedroom that night while they were podcasting, asleep on his shoulder. And then we fast forward to middle of the night in this little tiny townhome house where I'm sure you can hear a lot. And he has a nightmare middle of the night. They are trying desperately to get a hold of Chad and Lori. No success. The next morning comes around, and according to David or Melanie says that David asked if he could see JJ to find out if JJ was a zombie. Melanie Gibbs says that to police. David Warwick in court says that he asked where JJ was because he had heard he'd been crawling on cabinets and knocking off a picture of Jesus, and he wanted to make sure JJ was okay. He was just concerned about JJ. Although when he mentioned in his testimony that Chad and JJ got into a scuffle and that Chad then came away with a scratch on his neck, a 6'3", 6'3" man had a scratch on his neck from a 7-year-old boy. That didn't seem to concern him. But, not knowing where he was the next morning after this serious nightmare, they were allegedly concerned. So concerned, though, that they ended up leaving and never calling police. And here we are today.
The scratch is really disturbing, by the way. But let's. I don't think we have time to delve. We already talked about that on our last show a little bit. But I think the scratch indicates that Chad Daybell is perfectly capable of violence.
Yes.
So let's just say that. But putting that aside, the nightmare. So the way I see it, this nightmare is really important for many reasons. But let's break it down. There's essentially 3 scenarios, I think, that can occur with this nightmare. Number 1, there's no nightmare at all. The nightmare is fabricated, that they hear stuff, they hear perhaps violence, screaming, who knows what, and they call it a nightmare because they don't want to deal with the reality of what's occurring in that house. So that's scenario number 1. That's a really big question I have. I mean, Melanie Gibb claims that he was screaming or talking in his sleep, and that I think she woke him up, right? Like, if that's accurate, then I guess we have to say that he was asleep. But I think it's not. I'm speculating, but I think it's entirely possible that maybe he wasn't even asleep, that the so-called nightmare was in fact hearing something that they shouldn't have heard. They didn't want to get involved. They both agreed that David just conveniently lost all his memory that night. Also, as far as the nightmare goes, we don't know the content. He has never once disclosed what is in that nightmare, which for a psychologist, if a client comes into my office and they have a nightmare, I'm going to want to know what that is. Freud is famously known for saying that the unconscious is the royal road. That the royal road to the unconscious is dreams. And so if you're having a nightmare, it in theory would give you a lot of information, especially, you know, depending on the content. Like, what was in that nightmare? What happened in the nightmare? Why don't we know the content of that nightmare? Is it because there was no nightmare? Is it because they actually heard stuff and then they both agreed that they didn't want to talk about it? They didn't want to be dragged into court. They didn't want to become a part of the case. They both, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to push over into like conspiracy stuff here, but I have concerns that when you have the worst nightmare of your life and you don't remember it, it makes me question whether there was a nightmare at all, and whether in fact perhaps there was something they heard that they didn't want to hear and they wanted to distance themselves from this entire situation. So that's scenario one. The second scenario is that perhaps he was partially asleep and he heard some screaming and he ignored it and went back to sleep, and then he had a nightmare. Another scenario is that maybe he was fully asleep, that he heard some screaming or something. He was aroused a little bit. He was awakened a little bit, but went back to sleep and then had the nightmare. So I think, to me, those are different versions of what could have occurred. I think it's unlikely to me that on the night that JJ is murdered, he just happens to have the worst nightmare of his life. That seems like a little too coincidental. I don't agree with the timing of that. So also not being able to identify the content of that nightmare, I presume he's been asked many times, what was that nightmare about? And as far as I can tell, he's never described it. So that's troubling.
He was asked again, tell us about this nightmare. And he stated that this nightmare was the worst nightmare of his life and that he was screaming. And then that they went to go get a blessing. And then when they said, well, why would you need a blessing? He actually pointed the finger at his wife, Melanie Gibb, who I actually feel like he does a lot. He's kind of used her as a scapegoat to, she gets a lot more public shame and ridicule than he does because he kind of hides behind his wife. And so when he said, well, why, the defense, Archibald asks David Warwick, why did you need a blessing? And David said, well, it was my wife that wanted it. I didn't need a blessing. She wanted it. But this was also after the defense said to him, what's the difference between a nightmare and a vision? You're a visionary man. And he did this word salad. Like, it was so confusing. Like, look, I'm trying to follow these belief systems that they have. I could not understand what in the world David Warwick was saying when it came to the difference between a nightmare and a vision. And then at one point, Archibald says to him, well, they both are real. They're both real, and he doesn't say, he kind of admitted that they're both real in some way. They're a vision. And that made it a little weird too. Can I talk about how at the beginning when he almost wasn't even able to testify? Because that kind of is important, I think, to the nightmare too. Is that okay? And then I can ask your thoughts on the nightmare. So this is what I noticed. So right when David walked in, so this is how David walked in too. I was outside. We were having a break. We were having a 10-15 minute break because the witness needed to arrive still. That would be David Warwick. I was out talking to Nate Eaton, and all of a sudden some guy comes by throwing Nate a fist bump. I mean, Nate was just kind of standing, but he accepted the fist bump, I guess you could say. I looked over and it was David Warwick running in, and then he ran into court. And then once we were all seated, it started with David stating that he had completely forgotten that he had been subpoenaed and all the rules of the subpoena, that he wasn't supposed to talk to Melanie Gibb about her testimony, nor watch her testimony, nor watch anything about the case, because, how can you forget these rules the day before you're supposed to testify? And he admitted to watching Melanie Gibbs, or listening to Melanie Gibbs' audio of her testimony. He was not with her. They live in different states. She's in Arizona. He's in Utah. They have a long distance marriage, and they did not talk, but it took him 45 minutes of watching her testimony before he realized maybe he shouldn't. And they asked him where he was watching it, and then he said he stalled for a bit and said it was either East Idaho News or Hidden Crime. So then I said, objection, Your Honor, we're Hidden True Crime. No, it was so he mentioned Hidden Crime, and then the thing that stood out though that reminded me of Chad Daybell is he's explaining how he's explaining that he was sick and he was on antibiotics, so he blamed the antibiotics for making him forget, and then said, well, it was around 45 minutes when all of a sudden I realized my conscience was telling me that I should stop. And that's where I'm getting to, is when you read Chad Daybell's autobiography, Chad sort of has this outside voice that's talking to him. There's never just a thought process in Chad. It's always a different voice telling him something, whether it's don't go get your master's degree in college. It's not just his brain thinking, it's a voice telling him, don't kill these bees. You know, he talks about killing bumblebees. Don't kill these bees. And then it's an outside voice that tells him to stop, not his own conscience or his integrity or inner moral compass. And that's what I sensed with this statement by David Warwick is he's watching this testimony. He doesn't seem to have any feeling around it. He just pretty much admits, well, then around 45 minutes, a conscience, which I also take as a voice, is telling me that I should stop. And so then I stopped. Anyway, I'm talking a lot, but I wanted to throw that out there so you can understand. And I just have a lot of confused feelings about him.
Yeah,
If
rightly so.
David,
I mean, that he, in Melanie Gibbs' interview with Chandler Police, she says that he literally remembered nothing at all. Nothing. Zero. He completely blacked out. I mean, that's not a reasonable explanation for, you have this horrible nightmare, the worst nightmare of your life, and you don't remember it. You remember nothing. I mean, it's hard to fathom. Is it possible that he has some memory problems and maybe he's got some early dementia? Yeah, sure. There is some of that. Maybe this was very stressful. Maybe he did forget a big chunk of it. That's all possible, but I don't know. I just have to feel like there's more going on here than meets the eye. And
he remembered a little bit more this testimony. Yeah, he's stated before that he's blocked things out. I mean, he stuck to the basics and would like hem and haw, sort of like Melanie Gibb, but he never did say, I've completely forgotten everything like he has in the past.
Yeah, which shows, again, that makes one question his credibility. He remembers some, he doesn't remember anything. Now he remembers some. I mean, he goes back and forth. It's a problem. But again, for me, I still wonder what they heard that night. And I don't know. I mean, is it possible that this was a nightmare? Is it possible that it was based on maybe he didn't hear anything? Maybe there was no screaming. Maybe there was no scuffle with JJ. I don't know. It seems to me that's possible, but it seems that there's some connection between what happened to JJ and maybe some sounds or some whatever was going on there in that room and that nightmare.
Well, yeah, they said that JJ woke up in the middle of the night. Again, this is a small townhome.
Yeah.
That JJ woke up in the middle of the night, was climbing on top of the fridge, on top of the cabinets.
I thought that was earlier in the day.
No, that we were told during the trial by David Warwick that when he asked where JJ was, they relayed this information to him from the middle of the night, that he'd woke up and done these things. So of course they heard things. So I guess my question to you though is, John, I sense sort of a disconnect between David Warwick and his conscience, sort of like this. It's like a limb of his that he has to remember.
I think it's worthwhile. So, and again, this kind of gets into a little bit of Freudian stuff, but I think the nightmare is indicative of a fair amount of guilt. I think it's about guilt, and guilt obviously has a tie to conscience. So I think it seems to me like this nightmare is in some ways his attempt to work through his guilt. And in that sense, it becomes a proxy for a conscience, I guess, yes. Because he doesn't. Yeah, let's go with the first scenario where they heard stuff and didn't want to report it. Even then, he's going to feel guilt. even if there was no nightmare, he's going to have guilt. And for a normal person, of course, you just report it, call the police. But in this case, with their belief system, that's not as clear cut. So in that sense, he's got to work this through. I mean, whose side is he on? Is he on the side of justice if a child's being murdered, or is he on the side of the cult and their beliefs? And I mean, he's doing podcasts with them. He's going to conferences and speaking, right? I don't know. That's where this becomes,
and still
really...
to this day, he's still doing it. That's what else the defense got out of
him.
You know, so you're still preaching with.
Yeah, so that's where this becomes really complicated. You know, if there's no nightmare at all and he's just covering it up and trying to keep some distance from this, and perhaps he had nothing to do with it, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, there's still a big issue here about conscience, and seems to be a word he likes to throw around, by the way, but he's definitely trying to figure out, he's feeling some guilt, and he's trying to figure out his loyalties and where they belong. I mean, for most of us, I think it's a no-brainer. We pick up the phone, we say, hey, look, I'm worried. You know, he knows about the belief systems. He knows about zombies and possession. He knows about all of this stuff. And he's hearing this, right? I don't know what he's hearing. Let's say he's hearing JJ scream. For most of us, that's a no-brainer. You get on the phone with 911 and you say, hey, look, I don't know what's going on here, but please get the hell over here. For him, I don't know. Maybe maybe there was a nightmare. Maybe there wasn't. But if there wasn't, it becomes really problematic.
Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to not want the defense to succeed in showing that there were other people involved. I'll just say that. It's hard for me to not want.
Well, this was the type of witness they put him, the prosecution puts him up on the stand to verify certain facts that are critical to their case, that JJ was in that room, that they saw him, he was wearing the pajamas, right? I think they basically just wanted a simple fact witness. And the problem with that is when you bring on somebody like Warwick with these nightmares, you open the door to a lot of uncertainty, and you open the door. This is precisely the sort of thing the defense really relishes. And because you have a witness that's maybe not the best witness and obviously has some very extreme beliefs, and he's still involved in this group. And so, this becomes a problem for the prosecution, this type of witness. And if you look closely at this whole nightmare scenario, I mean, they're not breaking it down like we are, obviously, but man, it raises a lot of questions. And I'm not arguing that he didn't have a nightmare. I just think it seems peculiar.
Someone said, what do you mean he feels guilty? Because it seems like perhaps they don't have a lot of guilt.
Well, that's why he's processing it. Because it's a struggle. My point is that there's guilt there in the sense that he's trying to process it unconsciously through this nightmare rather than picking up the phone and doing the right thing immediately, which is to call the police. So that's what I mean. Like, most of us would just know what to do. It wouldn't be a question. We'd pick up the phone and we'd report possible violence or whatever's going on.
Right.
But for him, he's calling it a nightmare and he's deferring it. He's waiting. Oh, let me process this and figure out if I'm going to experience any guilt, or let's see what my conscience does with this. It took him 45 minutes for his conscience to kick in after he listened to Melanie Gibb, and he wasn't supposed to, right? 45 minutes is a long time for your conscience to kick in when you know you're not supposed to be doing that.
Right. Ozzy Tad says nightmare is an excuse for waking up and knocking on the door instead of saying they heard the crime being committed.
Yeah.
Someone else said that this idea that, he was climbing on the cabinet was also a cover up, perhaps from Lori and Chad when other things are happening. And I do want to say about the climbing on cabinet story, it's very interesting. If someone happens to have the link, feel free to share it. But Chad has a blog. A lot of it is private, but what goes on the web stays on the web. It's sort of like Vegas, I guess. And so Chad tells this exact story about his son Garth, by the way. that
Yeah.
Garth was little and he climbed on top of the fridge and on top of the cabinets above the fridge. It's very interesting, and that he went to the temple and he prayed about it. But if they're going to make up a story, there's a story for you.
Well,
Chad had already written about it.
it's also disturbing in the sense that there's this intentionality that they're attributing to JJ, which is that somehow what's most upsetting to me is that they somehow see JJ as being responsible for his own murder because he knocked over a picture of Jesus, right? Like they're making this connection between, oh man, he really defiled Jesus because he knocked over a picture of Jesus. To it in his testimony, he says essentially that JJ had an episode, he knocked over the picture of Jesus, and that's when Lori called Alex. Like that was the final straw. A 7-year-old mistakenly and by accident knocked over a picture of Jesus, and now he needs to be punished because that's it. Like, how could you possibly defile Jesus by knocking over his picture? Right? Like that.
Awful. And then to hear Colby state he was the sweetest, little boy.
Right. So I don't know. There's so many disturbing things in his testimony, and there's more questions than answers for sure. But
yeah,
that seems to be the nature of this trial.
I can't find the blog right away. But it's also in his autobiography. I'll try to post it later for those that are interested. You do need to go get our son. Is there anything else you want to say, sweetheart?
I think that's about it. I think for the Warwick testimony, the most important element was the nightmare, because it really, really, like I said, it really raises a lot of questions about what really went on that night and who knew what and who heard what. And, unfortunately, David Warwick and Melanie Gibb, assuming that they know what happened, they're not going to disclose that. So,
yeah.
And I'm not saying they did. I don't know. I guess I'd give them the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, they were there. They were in close proximity to potentially a murderous incident. Maybe they didn't hear anything. Maybe they don't know anything. I don't know. I suppose I give them the benefit of the doubt, but with a lot of question marks.
Yeah. Thank you, Donald, so much. Thank you to so many for your generosity and your support while John and I are apart doing this. I know you need to run, babe, and if you need to run right now, it's okay. I can conclude for you if you need to take off. But we're just so grateful for we're just so grateful for all of you that have made this possible. So thank you so much for your kindness, your support, your encouragement during this very, very busy time. And also thank you for your patience and your grace. We are behind a lot of things. We're behind on the podcast. We're behind on Patreon posts. John, did you post your Patreon post yet today?
No, I
Okay. Well, he'll be sending something soon with some updates.
It's still in draft form because
it's okay.
I had our son for most of the afternoon, and
it's
he
okay.
wanted to play, so yeah.
Yeah, so maybe it'll come tomorrow. But I just thank you, everyone, for a little bit of grace right now while we are desperately trying to figure out how to do everything and are in two separate states dividing forces to get that done. So thank you. And thank you for following along with us. So again, I'm live tweeting every day at twitter.com/hiddentruecrime, over on YouTube, which is here at youtube.com/hiddentruecrime. I will be sharing lunch lives. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification button so it'll tell you when I'm live. And then in the evenings, I go live with News Nation out front of the courthouse for Banfield with anchor Ashley Banfield. And after that is said and done, I will share those videos on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/hiddentruecrime, as well as Facebook/hiddentruecrime. We're hidden true crime across the board. Although David Warwick still thinks we're hidden crime, we're hidden true crime. So hopefully he's figured that out.
Right. You want to correct the record.
Yeah. We're so grateful again for the Village. We used Nate Eaton or East Idaho News's enhanced audio of Colby's call today. We feel very honored to be part of this village because this is about JJ and Tylee and Tammy and justice. And this has been 3 years. And we are so grateful for our army of gems to be here with us, because this case, for those of you that know that have been here with us from the beginning, this is our case. This is a case we care about. This is a case that means so much to us. So thank you for, being part of this while we cover this trial. So anything else, babe?
Yep. I want to reiterate the thanks to everyone. I did want to end with just a quick story. I was taking Banks to get something to eat earlier, and he said, and this is so that just to preface this, so it doesn't come out of the blue, this is about your brother. So,
okay. Thank you for the.
And this is the first time you're hearing this, but he said, Dad, he said, and it's kind of a heartbreaking story, but he said, Dad, is it better to be brain dead or to have a cracked skull? And I don't know where he got that exactly, but
well, I think he got that from my brother who's in Florida.
Right, he got that from your brother, and so it kind of took me by surprise. But I explained to him the differences, and I explained to him that his uncle Jamie, as far as we know, and fingers crossed, that he's just has a cracked skull, and that he seems to be recovering very slowly and steadily. But my
there
point
is brain activity. We've learned there is brain activity. He's not brain dead. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I explained that, and that I explained that brain dead was not a good state to be in. And but the point is that our little boy's thinking about his Uncle Jamie, and he loves his Uncle Jamie. And I want to tell that story that we're thinking about Uncle Jamie, and we love him, and we obviously hope for his recovery, and he's always in our thoughts no matter where we are. And so, like our little boy, we too are really thinking about him and praying for him, and I just want to make that known.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very hard to be here it's good to be here. It would be very hard to not be here. How about that? I think John and I both know it'd be very, very hard to not be here because we care so much about this case and JJ and Tylee and Tammy, and helping in any way we can. But it is at the same time difficult since, we're also my brother is still in a coma. There is brain activity. We're getting daily updates. I have siblings there. I need to go soon. But we also know, John knows this too, how proud Jamie was of Hidden True Crime. And I often think that he'd want me here too. But I'll be there sooner than later.
And your brother would call us in the middle of the night and talk to us at length about what we were up to. And he was so supportive. And so we're just all really pulling for him. So
yes,
I wanted to end with that note, and just to let you know that our son is thinking about him, and we are. And we dedicated our first episode to him, and I want to do that tonight too. So we hope you get well soon, Jamie.
Thank you. Get well soon, Jamie. All right, babe. Speaking of our son.
All right. Yep.
Let's grab him. I love you. It's good to see you.
Right. Yeah, I love you too.
And we'll talk soon again.
Right. Good night, everyone.
Okay. Good night.
Okay.
We'll see you. Bye.